Welcome back. This is part two of this introductory lecture. We just finished talking about our relationship to the dead and the way that has radically changed from ages past in the church. We're in a new kind of relationship with the dead in our modern society. Now I want to talk about time. And time is really important, but we don't give it as much thought as we should. Uh, just think about this. The way in which you tell time shapes the way you live. The way in which you tell time shapes the way you live. In many ways, time is this very oppressive ruler, and it's tied to death, right? Without death, without that kind of moment in your life, time then would change, right? Time would change if you didn't have this end time. But I want to talk briefly about time. What time is it? What time is it? Now, for many of you, this might be the morning, afternoon, evening. It could be 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. And you might say, that's what time it is. Others of you might say, well, it's the beginning of a school year. And this is the fall semester or spring semester, whatever. I mean, this is the beginning of a school semester. Others of you might be saying, this is the beginning of the NFL season. Or it's during the NBA playoffs. Right? Or baseball, we're in a particular time in the baseball season. Some of you might say, well, this is August 28th of 2021 or 2020 or 2020, whenever you're watching this. So there's multiple ways in which you will tell time. And those times are really important. Right? Some of you might also say, well, we're in the fall or in the spring or winter. All of those aspects of understanding time infringe on how we act. So take school, for instance. Once school begins, for you as a student and for many parents of children, all of a sudden your calendars radically change. Or say you're headed into a holiday, right? It could be a holiday time. I mean, already this is August, and I'm going into Home Depot and Lowe's, and you see Halloween decorations. They're trying to tell you what time it is. Right? Now, stores, shops, online ads, they do a really good job of trying to tell you what time it is, so that you purchase, are prepared for that time, purchase their goods and decorations, depending on what it is, right? So trying to think about what time it is really important. Now, for many Protestant Christians, there's no concept of church time. There's no acknowledgement that there's a way in which the church wants to tell time. And without that conception, my argument is that then we are just ruled by these other secular times. All right? They infringe on us rather than us living into what I would argue is kind of God's time. So let's look at the history of telling time. So during the 3rd century BC, we start finding sundials. And we realize that the sun is the way in which most people told time. And that's significant because if you think about it, many of us do not tell time by the sun. Because of the modern invention and technology of electricity, we have lights whenever we want it. But in the 3rd century BCE, that wasn't the case, obviously. So when the sun went down, you're starting to go to bed. When the sun came up, you start getting up. It doesn't matter if you're kind of more in the northern hemisphere, the equator, or southern hemisphere. The sun dictated your schedule. That's how you told time, by the sun. Around 150 BC, we start finding the kind of hourglass technology, or sand glass. Then you also have kind of these water clocks being developed in China, in places in Asia as well. So you start developing different tools, but that only usually gives you, at least hourglass and sand glasses, about a moment of time. You're able to measure periods of time, but not necessarily tell the whole of time. So you have that kind of technology, but it's not till really the 10th or 11th century that we start seeing the first mechanical clocks being created and constructed. And where they're constructed in the West is in monasteries and in cathedral churches. And this is why. The reason why monks want a mechanical clock is because they've been using probably a water clock. And that isn't that reliable, and you have to make sure you always have a source of water to mark the time. But why it's important for a monk to mark the time is because 7 times a day they're getting up to pray, or they're going to pray. And what they want to do is mark those hours faithfully and devoutly. They want to be devout in their worship of God. And to help them be devout in their worship of God, a mechanical clock helps them do that. Right? So the mechanical clock is an invention for worship. Let me read you a quote from Neil Postman. Neil Postman was a professor of communications and technology. And this is what he said. The clock had its origin in the Benedictine monasteries of the 12th and 13th centuries. The impetus behind the invention was to provide a more or less precise regularity to the routines of the monasteries, which required, among other things, 7 periods of devotion. And indeed it did. But what the monks did not foresee was that the clock is a means not merely for keeping track of the hours, but also of synchronizing and controlling the actions of men. And thus, by the middle of the 14th century, the clock had moved outside the walls of the monastery and brought a new and precise regularity to the life of the workman and the merchant. Quote, the mechanical clock, as Lewis Mumford wrote, made possible the idea of regular production, regular working hours, and a standardized product. End quote. In short, without the clock, capitalism would have been quite impossible. The paradox, the surprise, and the wonder are that the clock was invented by men who wanted to devote themselves more rigorously to God, ended as the technology of greatest use to men who wished to devote themselves to the accumulation of money. In the eternal struggle between God and mammon, the clock, quite predictably, favored the latter. That's what Neil Postman says. So you see, what happens is, after the invention of mechanical clocks, mayors and towns start really getting jealous of these pieces of technology, and they start putting them in their town squares. So now, instead of them being instruments for worship, they become instruments for production. And you have, for the first time, kind of the idea of a work hour. So you can be out in the town square and work for an 8-hour shift, and you'll see the clock in the town square. Now, even here, so if you weren't participating as a monk or nun in one of these monasteries or nunneries that had a clock, you still didn't have access to this mechanical timekeeping. If it was in a town square, you'd have to kind of walk to the town square to see what time it is. And so, really, most of society still was timed by natural rhythms. What you get is this technology of the clock, first becoming desk clocks or mantle clocks that rich people can buy in their houses. And then later in the 16th century, you get the development of pocket watches. So now people start taking their timekeeping with them. It's no longer kind of only when you're in the town square or only when you're in a cathedral or a monastery. Now you have it in your pocket. And that changes the way people live. Now, with the invention of smartphones and the iPhone in 2007, many people have moved away from having wristwatches or pocket watches. Though Apple's now got the Apple Watch, and that's somewhat popular. But for the majority of society today, the way in which time is told is on a phone, on a device that is connected to the internet and to the world. And so now this timekeeping on our phone also shapes the way we live and interact. So all of this timekeeping, the way we tell time, shapes the way we live. And I think that the model that Postman points out is really helpful. Is our timekeeping helping us grow in our worship, or helping us grow in our pursuit of money or other perhaps idolatrous things? So all this leads us to a conception of time which many people, and Charles Taylor, the philosopher, speaks of as standard average European time. Now, John Swinton, quoting Benjamin Whorf, defines this like this: standard average European time is an insistence on punctuality. That one be on point on the timeline, as they have promised. Synchronicity, the coordinated positioning of several people simultaneously on the timeline. Historiography and paleontology, the exact locating of past events on the timeline. And most revealing, a plethora of behaviors like wasting time, as one might waste perfectly good food, selling and buying time, as one would sell or buy apples or wheat, and saving time by shortening the distance traveled on the timeline to accomplish a task. All of these in turn imply a capacity to measure time, as one would measure any object with extension, by counting off seconds, minutes, or hours. Here's the thing: the technology of the clock loves speed. Loves speed. Okay? There's real power in clocks, and they shape the way we live. So what's your speed limit? If clock time is going fast, how fast are you going? Because a lot of time, and especially when you're in school and now you're in this online class, you have lots of tasks. You have lots of things ahead of you. We all have now new syllabi, new reading lists, new assignments, on top of the myriad of life that we're living. The responsibilities we have in our household, our communities, our churches. And so now thinking about how we can save time and move quickly and efficiently are key. And that's in part tied to the clock time. Right? And what happens is that we're going to be moving so fast that we're going to miss out on things. John Swinton borrows a concept from the Japanese theologian Kosuke Koyama, who points to the fact that the average speed at which a human being walks is 3 miles per hour. He says Jesus walked at 3 miles per hour. Jesus walked slowly. Love, he says, Swinton says, love has a speed. God walks slowly because he is love. If he is not love, he would have gone much faster. Love has its speed. It is a spiritual speed. It is a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we are accustomed to. It is slow, yet it is Lord over all other speeds, since it is the speed of love. It goes on in the depths of our life, whether we notice it or not, at 3 miles an hour. It is the speed we walk, and therefore the speed the love of God walks. Sit with that a little bit. If love has a speed, and you're going faster than, say it's 3 miles an hour, but we're going 40 miles an hour, that means that we're missing a lot of the things that God is doing and where God is. I mean, it's like we're getting ahead of God. Part of this is because attention is tied to love, and attention takes time. If I'm going to pay attention to you, I can't move quickly past you. Does that make sense? I can't move quickly past you. I have to move slowly. And this is the time of God that John Swinton argues. And I want you to engage his arguments, his evidence, and his kind of his narrative there about how we should think about time, especially God's time. And think about your speed limit, right? So the church has a time, and it's full time, and many Protestants don't have any connection to a church calendar. What I hope is that you become familiar with the church calendar after this course. Here's an image of the Godly Play curriculum and lesson on the church's calendar. I'm going to put a link up of the Godly Play lesson so you can watch them teach about kind of church time using this model. I find it really helpful. If we were live in class, I'd do it for us. But here online, you can watch them give that lesson. It helps you kind of understand that there's a rhythm of time. It also helps you understand that from the very beginning, Christians, with the resurrection of Jesus, changed the way they told time. Time had shifted. Time had changed with the birth, death, and resurrection ministry of Jesus Christ. So now, Jews who are following this faithful Messiah shift their day in many ways of worship, not to the last day, not to Saturday, though many of them continued worshiping on Saturday, but the primary day became quickly the first day, Sunday. And so worship became that Sunday day. Now, in some traditions, people talk about Sunday as the 8th day, right? It's the new last day, or it's the first day of creation. Now, Sunday is the first day of creation, and now with the resurrection, you have a new creation. And this is why Christians said we need to tell time differently. The resurrection marks a point in time that has to change the way we do time, live time, measure time, etc. And that has also been that calendar, that telling of time, has been shaped by the life of Jesus. Now, think of it. In some ways, that's true for us. We celebrate the birth of Christ. We pay tribute to that, and then we also pay tribute, most Christians, to the death and resurrection of Christ. But maybe not so much else in between or after. And if you take a look at this Godly Play lesson, you'll learn a little bit about more the other days. Now, what's also interesting is that the church not only populated its calendar with the events of the life of Jesus, I mean, not just the birth, death, and resurrection, but I mean the ascension, the dedication to the temple, his baptism, and the like. But the death of God's people, the saints, also became keys to telling time. So the martyrdom of Polycarp becomes an example, and you'll read a little bit about this, of how early Christians started to tell time. They started to use the death of saints, or martyrdom of saints, as periods on the calendar to remind them of the resurrected Lord. All right? And so Polycarp was a saint. He was somebody who reflected the life of Jesus to others. And in commemorating his life, we're commemorating the life of Jesus. That is a resurrected life, a living life. The living Lord worked in the life of Polycarp and all these other saints. And so the calendar becomes populated with these kind of martyrdom days, birthdays of the saints to help us remember of and how the resurrected Lord has acted and is still acting in our world. Now, unfortunately, with the Protestant Reformation, this shifts. And so in evangelical Christianity that was highly influenced by John Wesley, John Wesley said this in a letter prefacing the prayer book for American Methodist societies. He's writing telling them why he has dropped so many of the celebrations from the calendar, especially the saint days. He stated that most of the holy days, so-called, are omitted, as at present answering no valuable end. So you see, the saints start coming out. Our relationship with the dead is shifting from our calendar, the way we tell time. This is in part not Wesley's fault, but he inherits this from a kind of Protestant impetus, where in 1523 Luther says, "We in Wittenberg intend to observe only the Lord's days and the festivals of the Lord. We think that all the feasts of the saints should be abrogated, or if anything in them deserves it, it should be brought into the Sunday sermon." Calvin follows suit. And this is part of a polemic with the existing Catholic Church. We're going to have a different type of calendar. We're not going to have all these festivities around these other things. We're going to focus on Jesus. The problem is, and then there were real issues in regards to how saints were celebrated, and still a little bit today. Though after Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Church has kind of addressed many of those issues. The problem is that in celebrating a saint, you're not celebrating the saint per se. You're celebrating the work of the resurrected Lord in this person. You're reminding yourself that Jesus isn't someone that only lived in the first century, but has been active throughout the history of the church up until this day. And that's how the saints help you tell, in some ways, time, how the resurrected Lord has changed time, because he transcends it and is active in it today. But we've cut them out from our calendar. So, the way in which we tell time shapes us. And that shapes our understanding of church history. It also shapes our understanding of our Christian identity. So this is a critical phrase. I want you to kind of think about it. The way you are timed shapes the story you're in. The way you are timed shapes the story you're in. Right? Ponder that. Think a little bit about that. This will end kind of part 2 of this lecture, and then we'll move on to part 3. All right? We'll see you in the next part.